my daughter said. It's better if you don't come. You'd ruin the fun. I stayed away silently and didn't attend the wedding. Same with all the vendors I paid. The decoration, chairs, and food. None of them showed up. What happened next was rather unexpected. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel to support us. It will be great to know in the comments section where you are listening from. Now let me tell you everything that happened. I used to believe there was no greater achievement in my life than being a good father. Not the promotions, not the house I built with my bare hands, not even surviving the wreckage of a divorce that left me gutted and unsure of everything. Except her. My daughter, Elena. She was 5 when her mother walked out. Said she was tired of playing house with a man who worked too much and laughed too little. Maybe she wasn't wrong, but I stayed. I learned how to braid hair from a YouTube video. I packed lunches with little notes. I sat in the front row at every school recital, even when she just stood there, mouthing the words, too shy to sing. I became dad in every sense of the word. Cook, chauffeur, math tutor, emotional punching bag. And I never asked for anything in return. Not because I didn't want to, but because that's what love was to me. Doing the hard parts, the boring parts, the everyday parts without applause. Until she looked at me with eyes that said I was her whole world. That was enough. She asked me to walk her down the aisle 3 days after the engagement. I still remember the way she burst into my office with a ring on her finger and tears in her eyes, laughing, showing me the tiny stone like it was a crown jewel. You're walking me down the aisle, right, Dad? She asked, already assuming the answer. I couldn't speak. I just nodded and hugged her so tight I think I cracked her back. That night, I opened a new savings account. I called my buddy from high school who now ran an event planning company. I even emailed 3 florists before she'd even chosen a date. I didn't wait. I wanted to be ready. I told myself this was what all those years had built toward, one final act of fatherhood before she truly became someone else's priority. But then things started to shift. At first, it was small, like she stopped calling me Dad and started calling me Rick in front of her fiancé's friends. Said it felt more adult. She brushed off my opinions like lint off a jacket. When I suggested a song for the father-daughter dance, she smiled like I'd offered to play Nickelback at a funeral. We're doing something more modern, she said. It's not really your vibe. That hurt more than I let on. I told myself it was wedding stress, that she was just overwhelmed. But it kept happening. She planned vendor meetings without me, even though I was the one footing the bills. One day I saw on Instagram that they'd toured the venue. When I asked her why she hadn't invited me, she laughed and said, Dad, you wouldn't have liked it anyway. Just like that. As if my presence was a complication, not a comfort. I wish I could say I stood up for myself then, that I confronted her, drew some kind of boundary. But the truth is, I didn't. I swallowed it. Like I'd swallowed so much over the years. The missed birthdays because of custody exchanges. The holidays where she chose her mother over me. The calls that went unanswered. I told myself this was part of parenting, letting go, even when it stings. But it didn't feel like letting go. It felt like being pushed out. Like I was being slowly edited out of her life, piece by piece, until all that remained was a signature on a check and a seat near the exit. I remember one particular night. She was sitting across from me at the kitchen table, scrolling through Pinterest boards. She was showing me floral arrangements and menu cards, barely looking up. I offered to host the rehearsal dinner at the lake house. Grill some steaks, have a little fire pit going, keep it relaxed. She didn't even pause before saying, yeah, Jordan's mom actually wants to do that at their place. She thinks yours is a little rustic. I nodded, said nothing, but my throat tightened in that way it does when you're about to cry but won't let yourself. That house was where I taught her to swim, where we built snowmen in the winter and chased fireflies in July. And now, suddenly, it was too rustic. I started noticing how she kept saying Jordan's family this and Jordan's parents that, as if they were the architects of her new life, and I was just a footnote. It wasn't just about being excluded. It was about how easily she seemed to forget all the ways I'd shown up. I wasn't perfect, God knows that. I worked long hours. I didn't always know how to talk about emotions. But I was there. I was always there. And yet, the closer we got to the wedding, the further away she drifted. It felt like she was building a new world, and there was no space for me in it. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone with someone. I think it was her cousin. She was in the living room, not realizing I was down the hall. She said, "Honestly, I think Dad being there might ruin the vibe. He's so serious all the time. It's supposed to be fun, you know." I stood there frozen, holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She said it so casually, not with malice, but with something worse, indifference. Like my presence was a mood killer, like I was an outdated piece of furniture that didn't match the new aesthetic. That night, I didn't eat dinner. I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey and watched the sun go down behind the trees. I tried to remember the last time we'd really laughed together. Not just small talk or polite chuckles, but real, gut-deep laughter. I couldn't. All I could remember were brief hugs and distracted phone calls, and the quiet realization that I'd somehow become an inconvenience in my own daughter's life. I had paid for the venue, the chairs, the caterer, the photographer. I had written checks without flinching because I thought it meant something. But sitting there on that porch, it hit me. Love that's taken for granted turns into expectation. And expectation, when left unchecked, becomes entitlement. I didn't say anything to her. Not then. I still thought, somehow, that things would shift back. That she'd have a moment of clarity and remember who stood by her when everyone else didn't. But deep down, I knew that moment might never come. And the worst part wasn't the exclusion. It was how numb I was starting to feel about it all. Like a light that had been flickering for years had finally just gone out. It was a Thursday afternoon when she finally said it. Just blunt enough to sting, but casual enough to pretend it wasn't meant that way. We were standing in her fiancé's backyard, going over seating charts, something I wasn't even supposed to be involved in. But she needed help moving tables, so she called me. I thought maybe that meant we were turning a corner. Maybe this was her quiet way of re-inviting me back into the fold. I even brought iced coffees from her favorite spot, just like old times. But instead of warmth, all I got was that tight-lipped smile she always wore when she was tolerating me rather than enjoying my company. I should have known then. We had just finished adjusting the folding chairs when she paused, chewing on her lower lip like she was trying to word something carefully but couldn't quite find the polite version. She looked up and said, "Hey, Dad, I've been thinking, maybe it's better if you don't come to the wedding." Just like that. No warning. No build-up. Just a verbal gut punch tossed out like a weather update. I stood there for a second, not even breathing. My brain didn't register the words right away. It was like hearing a car crash happen in slow motion, but your body's too slow to respond. I asked her what she meant, thinking maybe I misheard. Maybe she meant something else. She sighed, shifted her weight, and said, "It's just you and Mom in the same room? It'll be tense. And I really just want the day to be easy, you know? Fun. You'd ruin the fun." That's what she meant. She didn't have to say it directly. I could hear it in the tone, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her fiancé stood a few feet away pretending to scroll through his phone, pretending not to hear a daughter tell her father he was better left absent on the most important day of her life. And for what? For peace? For aesthetics? For some sanitized version of joy that didn't include the man who taught her how to ride a bike and cry without shame? I nodded, trying to keep my face from giving too much away. I felt my throat tighten, but I swallowed hard and gave her a flat. "Okay, if that's what you want." She looked almost relieved when I said it, like she had been bracing for a fight and didn't know what to do with my silence. I stood there, hands in my pockets, trying not to let the heat rise to my face. I felt like a guest in someone else's life, someone easily dismissed. She went back to her clipboard, rambling about tablecloth colors and DJ set lists, like she hadn't just uninvited her own father, like she hadn't just taken a blade to something sacred and expected me to thank her for doing it cleanly. I stood there for a few more minutes, but I don't remember a word she said after that. All I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears and the quiet voice in my head that whispered, "You're just the wallet. You were always just the wallet." Driving home, I kept one hand tight on the steering wheel and the other clenched around the iced coffee I never even opened. The condensation bled into my palm, soaking my jeans. I didn't care. I played her words over and over in my head like some sick loop I couldn't shut off. Maybe it's better if you don't come. No anger. No remorse. Just cold, managerial rejection. I'd have preferred a fight. Yelling. Accusations. At least that would have meant I mattered enough to argue with. But indifference? That kind of dismissal cuts deeper than rage. It tells you you're not even a factor in the equation. You're a line item, something to be moved or removed without consequence. I didn't tell anyone what she said that day. Not my brother. Not my best friend. Not even the woman I'd been seeing quietly for the past few months. A kind soul named Maria who always asked about Elena like she was her own. I couldn't say the words out loud without feeling like a failure. Like maybe this was my fault. Maybe I hadn't hugged her enough. Or maybe I hugged her too much and smothered her. Maybe I should have stayed in that loveless marriage longer just to keep a two-parent household. Maybe I was too serious, too quiet, too something. Or maybe she had just stopped seeing me as human a long time ago, and I was only now catching up to that reality. 2 days after she said it, I went back to my desk. I opened the spreadsheet, same one I'd been using for 6 months to track every dollar I'd spent. The total sat at $31,487.37. Venue deposit, catering, DJ, chair rentals, floral arrangements, custom signage, all paid by me. Not because she asked, but because I wanted to give her something special. Something that said, I love you. I'm proud of you. I'm still your dad. And now, all I could think about was how none of that mattered. I was still unwanted, still unnecessary, just a shadow at the edge of her new life, politely asked to stay in the dark. That night, I started making calls. Quietly, methodically. No announcements. No grand speeches. I called the florist first. Asked if we were still within the cancellation window. We were. I canceled. I called the chair rental vendor next. Canceled. The caterer took some negotiating, but I got a partial refund. The venue? I'd lose my deposit, but I pulled the remaining balance. They didn't ask why. I didn't offer it. I just said plans had changed and left it at that. One by one, I pulled the threads of the wedding I had paid for, until the whole thing hung by a thread of other people's promises and none of mine. I didn't do it out of spite. I need to make that clear. This wasn't about revenge. This was about dignity. About no longer participating in a fantasy where I fund the joy of people who no longer want me around. I thought about calling her, telling her outright, but some part of me wanted her to feel it, to discover it the way I had discovered my own absence. Unexpected, brutal, and irreversible. She wanted me gone. Fine, but my money goes where I go, and if I'm not welcome, neither is a single cent of what I've built. I never knew silence could feel so loud until I started making those calls. It was like each vendor I spoke to stripped away a layer of something I hadn't realized I was still holding on to. Hope, maybe, or the illusion that I still mattered to her beyond the bottom line. Every conversation started the same way. Hi, this is Rick Hastings. I'd like to cancel my order. Some tried to talk me out of it, asked if everything was okay, offered alternatives. I gave them nothing but courtesy and finality. Because deep down, I knew if I let even one of them sway me, I'd unravel all over again. And I couldn't afford to unravel, not this time. The florist was the hardest to let go. I'd worked with them personally, handpicked every flower, down to the shade of rose and the arch design for the altar. It was the only part of the wedding Elena actually seemed excited to plan with me. We had sat at the kitchen table for nearly 2 hours scrolling through pictures, laughing over how Jordan didn't know the difference between hydrangeas and peonies. That night had almost felt like old times. Like maybe we were still tethered to each other in some unspoken way. But now that memory felt bitter. Not because it wasn't real, but because it was the last moment I let myself believe she still saw me as her dad, not her financier. I kept the cancellations quiet. No text to her. No heads up to the vendors about who else might be impacted. I didn't know anyone that explanation. They hadn't warned me when she decided I wasn't invited to the biggest day of her life. No courtesy call. No soft landing. Just a brick wall and a smile. So I returned the gesture, not out of cruelty, but out of principle. I wasn't going to beg for a seat at a table I paid to build. I wasn't going to smile through gritted teeth and watch from the shadows as my daughter danced in a dress I funded, beneath lights I rented, surrounded by people who didn't even know how often I sacrificed so she could feel loved, stable, whole. Somewhere between canceling the custom signage and pulling the plug on the sound system rental, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in months, relief. Not the kind that comes with joy, but the kind that follows the end of a long illness. Like I was finally giving myself permission to stop performing in a role that no one appreciated anymore. I'd spent so much of the last year pretending I didn't notice the distance, the dismissiveness, the way she lit up for everyone but me. Pretending I was okay being just dad in the financial sense. Now I didn't have to pretend anymore. I was done. I poured myself a glass of scotch that night and sat out on the back deck as the sun dipped below the trees. The air smelled like rain was coming, sharp and earthy. I watched the shadows stretch across the yard, long and soft, like ghosts just starting to wake. I thought about the first time I ever held her. She was 6 pounds, screaming like her lungs had something to prove. I remember looking at her and thinking, whatever happens, I will never let you down. And for nearly 3 decades, I didn't. Even when her mother left. Even when I couldn't afford the better school district. Even when I had to take night shifts just to make Christmas happen. I never let her down. But maybe, just maybe, she let me down. And that was the pain I hadn't allowed myself to admit. I think there's a moment in every parent's life when they realize their child no longer sees them as a person, just a resource, a means to an end, a backdrop to their main character storyline. It doesn't always come with shouting or some catastrophic fallout. Sometimes it comes with silence, with unreturned calls, with the slow fade of invitations and inside jokes, with a daughter who calls her father by his first name and tells him his presence is a liability. It's 1,000 little moments, all stacking quietly, until one day you look around and realize you're not even in the picture anymore. You're just the frame. The final vendor was the chair rental company. I had chosen white Chiavari chairs with custom navy cushions, Elena's favorite color. That detail had felt important once. Now it felt absurd. I canceled the order in less than 5 minutes. No hesitation. No second guessing. When I hung up, I stared at my phone for a long time, waiting for something to hit me. Regret, guilt, maybe even a last-minute urge to reverse it all. But none of it came. Just silence. Peaceful. Hollow. Real. I finally understood that this wasn't just about the wedding. It was about the years leading up to it, the gradual erasure of everything I had meant to her. And I was done pretending that didn't hurt. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed up listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, wondering how long it would take her to notice. Would she find out the night before? The morning of? Would she panic? Cry? Blame me for ruining her perfect day? Probably. But for once, I wasn't going to cushion the blow. I wasn't going to absorb the pain just to keep the peace. I had done that for too long. Always the buffer. Always the one who bent first. No more. She made her choice, said it plain. It's better if you don't come. Well, that's what she was going to get. And maybe next time she'd think twice before treating love like an obligation. There's something freeing about reclaiming your power, even when it comes too late. Even when it leaves a hollow ache in your chest. That night, as the first raindrops started to fall, I sat out on the porch and let them hit my face. I didn't move, didn't flinch. I just let the cold soak in and reminded myself, again and again, that I had every right to protect my dignity, even from my own child. Especially from my own child. And in that quiet, rainy moment, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't cruelty. This was closure. The morning of the wedding was eerily quiet. I woke up before the sun, not because I had anywhere to be, but because my body was still trained to show up for her. Old habits don't die easy, especially not the ones carved from years of early school drop-offs, packed lunches, and driving to every recital, whether she asked me to or not. I made coffee the way I always did, strong, black, no sugar, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the clock. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Outside, the world was waking up to what should have been her perfect day. And I was just sitting in my house, alone, watching time pass like it didn't belong to me anymore. I expected the guilt to hit harder that morning. I thought I'd wake up drowning in second guesses, that I'd feel like a villain, like the bitter old man who let pride win over love. But instead, all I felt was this strange clarity. Like for the first time in months, maybe even years, I was finally being honest with myself. She didn't want me there. Not really. Not in any way that counted. She didn't want my stories, my advice, my presence. She wanted my wallet, my signature on invoices, and my silence in return. And I had given her all of that until now. This day, I owed her nothing. Not my appearance. Not my apology. Not my guilt. She made the rules, and I had simply followed them. I kept my phone off until about 10 a.m. I wasn't ready to hear the chaos just yet. I imagined the guests arriving at the venue to find no chairs, no flowers, no catering staff setting up trays of hors d'oeuvres. I pictured Elena walking in with her perfectly done makeup, her bouquet in hand, and stopping cold at the sight of an empty altar. No music, no signage, no lights strung from the archway I had paid extra to customize. I wondered how long it would take her to realize it wasn't a mix-up, that the absence was intentional, that this emptiness was what she had asked for when she told me to stay away. Around noon, the calls started coming in. My phone buzzed like it was possessed, each ring a pulse of anxiety and vindication. I let it go for a while. Just listened to the sounds of desperation pouring into my voicemail. First it was the venue manager, sounding flustered and confused. Then her cousin Sarah, asking if I had any idea what was going on. Then Jordan's mother, her voice sharp, accusatory, like I was a saboteur instead of the man who had been disinvited from his own daughter's life. I didn't answer any of them. I wasn't ready to be dragged back into a narrative where I was always the one to fix what everyone else broke. Not this time. Elena finally called at 1:42 p.m. The ceremony had been scheduled for 2. I stared at her name on the screen for a long second before I picked up. I didn't say hello. I just waited. Her voice came through in jagged, breathless sobs. "Dad, what did you do?" she cried. And for a moment, I could hear the little girl in her again. The one who scraped her knee and ran straight into my arms. But that little girl was long gone, replaced by someone who hadn't seen me as a father in months, maybe years. "The flowers, the food, nothing's here," she said. "You promised. You said you'd take care of it." Her voice cracked, raw and panicked. "How could you do this to me?" I took a breath. Not because I was angry, but because I wanted to make sure I said exactly what needed to be said. No more, no less. "Elena," I said quietly, evenly, "you told me not to come. You said I'd ruin the fun, so I made sure I didn't." There was a long pause. No sound except her shaky breath on the other end. "If you don't want me there," I added, "you shouldn't expect my money to be there either." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell. I didn't call her names. I just said the truth, and I let it sit there like a weight she finally had to carry. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was furious. "This was spiteful," she snapped. "This was evil. You ruined my wedding." And maybe in her eyes, I had. Maybe that made me the villain. But I wasn't interested in defending myself. Not anymore. "You made your choice," I told her. "You can't erase someone from your life and still expect their support. That's not how love works. That's how users operate. And I won't be used anymore." I heard her gasp, whether in anger or disbelief, I don't know. She hung up before I could say anything else. The rest of the day was a blur. More calls, more texts, a few not-so-subtle posts online, people alluding to a family betrayal or disaster wedding. I didn't reply. I didn't explain, because the truth didn't need defending. I didn't sabotage her day. I simply stopped financing a dream I was no longer welcome to be part of. It was never about the money. It was about the message, about the dignity I had quietly forfeited for years, thinking that sacrifice was the same thing as love. But sacrifice without respect? That's just self-erasure. I poured myself another drink around sunset, watched the light bend across the living room floor, the way it used to when Elena was small and would dance in it like a fairy caught in a sunbeam. I felt something between heartbreak and relief. The ache of losing her. The peace of choosing myself. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just sat in that moment, finally honest about what had happened. She didn't just uninvite me from a wedding. She uninvited me from the role I'd held my entire life. And I had simply agreed to exit quietly, taking the decorations and the catering with me. The silence between me and Elena stretched into days, then a week. But the world around us didn't stay quiet. People talk, especially family. Especially when a wedding ends in chaos and someone needs to be blamed. At first, the backlash came in whispers. A text from my sister. "What the hell happened?" A voicemail from my ex-wife. her voice soaked in rage. "You've always been selfish, Rick. This is just who you are." I didn't respond to either of them. Not because I didn't have words, but because I was too damn tired of defending myself to people who never once tried to understand where I was coming from. They all saw the wedding day as a disaster. But for me, it was just the end of a very long chapter, one where I gave everything and got nothing but silence and distance in return. The rumors started making the rounds faster than I expected. I wasn't on Facebook anymore, but that didn't stop screenshots from reaching me. People I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had opinions. Some vague status updates from one of Elena's bridesmaids. Some parents really know how to ruin everything. A post from Jordan's aunt that read like a sermon on forgiveness. Family should show up no matter what. No excuse. Each one felt like a knife wrapped in sugar. Passive-aggressive, moral-sounding, but deeply pointed. It was clear who the villain was in their minds. The absentee father. The saboteur. The bitter man who couldn't handle his daughter getting married without turning it into a power play. No one asked what led to it. No one cared to. I started getting side-eyed at work, too. A few colleagues had heard about the fiasco through the grapevine. Wives who were friends with someone on the guest list. I'd catch them whispering near the break room, then suddenly go quiet when I walked in. One even had the nerve to ask, "You really canceled your daughter's wedding?" I looked at him, dead in the eye, and said, "No. I just canceled the parts one paid for." He didn't have much to say after that. Still, it wore on me. That steady pressure of judgment from people who only saw the outcome and not the years that led to it. People who believed that being a father meant being a doormat, no matter how many times you're stepped on. What hurt the most, though, was the people who I thought would get it, the ones who knew the history, who had seen me show up time and time again, who still chose to stay neutral. My brother called one evening, voice low, trying to play peacemaker. "Look, man," he said, "I get that you were hurt. But canceling everything? That was nuclear. She's your kid. You don't just walk away like that." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how easy it was for him to say that from the sidelines. I didn't walk away, I told him. I stayed longer than I should have. I gave more than I should have. And I finally reached my limit. That's not nuclear. That's survival. Maria, the woman I'd been seeing, was the only one who offered something resembling understanding. We weren't serious, but she was kind, grounded, and knew how to listen without trying to fix me. She came over the weekend after the wedding and brought homemade empanadas. We sat on the porch, and after a long silence, she asked, "Do you regret it?" I stared out at the yard, the place where I once built Elena a sandbox and later a hammock she barely used. I thought about the look on her face when she called me that day, how her voice cracked with disbelief that I'd actually done it. "No," I said slowly. "I regret that it had to come to that. But not what I did. I did what I needed to." Even with Maria's support, doubt crept in at night like an old injury aching in bad weather. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything. Was there a version of this story where I still showed up, still paid, and left with my head held high? Maybe. But would that have taught her anything? Would it have changed how little she valued me? Or just reinforced it? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that the man I used to be, the one who said yes just to keep the peace, was gone. That man had died somewhere between her telling me I'd ruined the fun and me canceling the chair rental. And in his place stood someone who had finally remembered his own worth. I tried writing her a letter once. Not to apologize, but to say everything I didn't get to say on the phone. I poured out 3 pages about fatherhood, about disappointment, about what it means to feel invisible in the life of someone you raised. But I never sent it. Something about putting it in the mail felt too much like a bid for reconciliation. And I wasn't looking to be invited back in. I just wanted to be heard. But if I'd learned anything from this, it's that not everyone wants to hear the truth, especially not when it comes from the person they've decided to scapegoat. The house felt quieter in the weeks that followed. Not just because she stopped calling, but because that sense of anticipation, the one that had filled the air for months, was gone. There were no more vendor calls. No budget updates. No requests for money disguised as updates. I didn't realize how much space that wedding had taken up in my life until it was over. I started filling the silence with things I'd forgotten I enjoyed. Long walks. Sunday football. Dusting off the guitar I hadn't touched in years. It didn't fix the ache, but it gave it somewhere to go. And through it all, I kept thinking about a line I'd heard once in a podcast of all places. You teach people how to treat you by what you allow. I had allowed too much for too long. Allowed disrespect, distance, dismissiveness, all because I thought that was the price of unconditional love. But now I saw it differently. Unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional access. It doesn't mean funding joy you're not welcome to be part of. It doesn't mean setting yourself on fire to keep someone else's life warm. 3 months passed before I heard her voice again. It came through a voicemail on a random Thursday afternoon, right as I was changing the oil on the truck. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me to listen. Her voice cracked right out of the gate, soft, brittle, like she'd rehearsed the message a dozen times and still couldn't find the right tone. Hey, Dad, I don't even know if you'll listen to this. A pause. I just wanted to say I still don't agree with what you did, but I guess I understand why. I'm still hurt. But I guess you were hurt too. That was it. No apology. No plea for reconciliation. Just a fractured sentence that hung in the air long after the message ended. I didn't call her back. Not because I was angry. I wasn't. Not anymore. The anger had burned itself out weeks ago, leaving behind something quieter. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not yet. But acceptance. I had finally come to terms with the truth that took me decades to face. Sometimes love isn't enough to hold a relationship together. Sometimes, love without respect is just pain in disguise. And I had spent far too long mistaking loyalty for love. Letting myself be drained by people who smiled when they needed something and vanished when they didn't. That wasn't parenting. That was martyrdom. And I had no intention of dying for someone else's version of happiness ever again. I didn't delete the voicemail. I kept it. Not because I needed to replay it, but because it reminded me of something vital. I had finally stood up for myself. Not in anger. Not in some explosive, dramatic fashion. But with quiet certainty. The kind of strength that doesn't raise its voice, that doesn't seek applause, but simply says, enough. That wedding had been the last test. A chance for her to show me she still saw me as a father, as a man worth including, not just a line on an invoice. And when she failed that test, I chose to walk away, not with vengeance, but with dignity. That, more than anything, was my justice. Maria was the one who suggested the fishing trip. Said I needed a change of scenery, something that didn't smell like old grief or gasoline. We packed up my gear, drove 2 hours out to the lake, and rented a little cabin for the weekend. No cell service, just trees, water, and the sound of wind pushing through pine needles. I stood out on the dock that first morning, watching the mist rise off the lake, and felt something loosen in my chest. For the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for a phone call, or an apology, or some sign that I still mattered to someone who clearly didn't want to show it. I thought of Elena a lot during that trip. Not in the way I used to, panicked, heartbroken, desperate for connection, but in a quieter, more grounded way. I thought about the little girl who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from softball. The teenager who slammed doors when I didn't let her date that college guy. The young woman who asked me to walk her down the aisle and then told me weeks later that I didn't belong. I missed her, of course I did. But I also knew that missing someone didn't mean you owed them continued access to your soul. You can love someone deeply and still choose to protect yourself from them. By the time we got back from the lake, I felt lighter. I started fixing up the garage, finally cleared out the boxes I'd meant to toss since last winter. I picked up my guitar more often, even started playing with some guys from work. Small things, but they felt like steps toward myself, toward the man I was before I let fatherhood become a form of self-erasure. I didn't need a grand gesture from Elena. I didn't need public vindication or family redemption. All I needed was peace. And slowly, I was finding it. People still ask. Not often, but enough. My neighbor, a well-meaning guy with too much time on his hands, asked if we'd patched things up yet. I told him the truth. No, and we might not. And that's okay. He looked at me like I'd just admitted to burning down my own house. But I didn't explain myself. I didn't know him that. I don't know anyone that. Let them talk. Let them speculate. They weren't there for the long nights, the ignored calls, the quiet dismissals disguised as modern boundaries. They didn't sit at that table alone after the rehearsal dinner was moved. They didn't get told, "It's better if you don't come." I did. And I lived through it. And I came out stronger. There was one moment, weeks later, when I saw her in town. Just a glimpse. She was coming out of a bakery, holding a box, laughing with a friend. I was across the street, half shielded by a tree. She didn't see me. I didn't wave. And for a brief second, I felt that familiar ache, that old reflex to cross the road, to say hi, to pretend like none of it had happened. But I stayed where I was, watched her walk away, and then I turned around and went home. Not out of bitterness, not out of pride, but because I finally understood the power of restraint, of letting go without fanfare, of knowing your worth, even when someone else refuses to see it. This wasn't the ending I imagined. I used to picture a wedding day where I gave a speech that made everyone cry, where we danced, where she hugged me tight and said, "I couldn't have done this without you, Dad." But real life isn't a script. It's messy, unfair, and sometimes the people you love most will break your heart without blinking. The question isn't whether it hurts. It's whether you keep bleeding for them, or whether you finally learn to stitch yourself up. So I stitched, slowly, quietly, without ceremony. And in that silence, I found something stronger than the need to be right or forgiven. I found my boundary. I found my peace. And I'll never trade it again. Not for love, not for family, not even for her. Have you ever reached a point where silence felt louder than words? Where the only way to reclaim your peace was to walk away from someone you love? If this story struck a chord, tell us your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you've ever had to choose yourself over family, know that you're not alone. Hit like, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories about boundaries, betrayal, and learning how to stand your ground, no matter who it hurts. See you soon in the next one.